The number is 1,500 years. That is the gap between what ancient engineers had already built and what our history books say humanity had to wait to discover. 1,500 years. Think about what that means for a moment. Not centuries of slow progression. Not gradual refinement. A gap. Clean, deliberate, and almost impossible to explain by accident alone. I came across this while researching something else entirely, the flooding of the Library of Alexandria. I had been going through reconstructed catalog lists, fragmented references, the kind of dry archival work that most people abandon after an afternoon. And then I found it. A reference so brief it could have been a copyist's error. A machine described as drawing energy from the eternal motion of the heavens, without fire, without wind, without the labor of men. The document was a partial translation of a work attributed to Hero of Alexandria, held in fragmented form at the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, catalogued but largely unexamined since 1891. That phrase, without fire, without wind, without the labor of men, stayed with me for weeks. Here is the official story. The history of energy generation follows a tidy arc. Fire, then steam, then electricity. Human civilization, according to the accepted narrative, spent several thousand years burning things. The ancient world, brilliant in philosophy and art, lacked the mechanical sophistication to harness energy in any truly autonomous way. The Greeks had clever toys. The Romans had water wheels. The Middle Ages gave us windmills. And the Industrial Revolution, that great rupture of the 1700s, finally handed humanity the power to exceed what a human body could generate. Clean, linear, and reassuring. That is the story we are taught. Let me be fair to that narrative before I challenge it. Much of it is substantially true. We have no peer-reviewed, fully intact, third-party verified ancient machine that undeniably generated free energy in the modern thermodynamic sense. The mainstream position is not stupid. It is cautious. And caution, in the face of evidence as fragmentary as this, is intellectually defensible. But let's start with the numbers. Because the numbers are where things get interesting. Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, documented in his Pneumatica a series of devices that modern engineers have since reconstructed with some astonishment. The Yalopile, his rotating steam engine, was dismissed for nearly 2 millennia as a novelty. Toy. It was not classified as a precursor to the industrial steam engine until scholars in the 1800s revisited it. That reclassification took 1,800 years. Not because the device changed, because the framing did. Which brings me to the Baghdad Battery. In 1936, a worker near the village of Kujut Rabua, outside Baghdad, unearthed a clay jar containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod. Dated to between 250 BCE and 640 CE, the range itself a point of contention, the object became known as the Baghdad Battery, and when researchers at General Electric recreated it in the 1940s using grape juice as an electrolyte, they confirmed it produced approximately 1.5 volts of electric current. 1.5 volts. In the Parthian Empire. The object is currently held at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The documentation of its original excavation was conducted under the oversight of German archaeologist Wilhelm Koenig, whose 1940 paper, Ein galvanisches Element aus der Partherzeit, remains accessible in the archives of the Jahrbuch für Prähistorische und Ethnographische Kunst. What was it for? The official explanation, electroplating, is actually more remarkable than it sounds. Electroplating requires a sustained, controlled electrical current. If that is what this device was designed to produce, then Parthian craftsmen understood something about electrochemical energy generation that the Western world would not formally rediscover for another 15 centuries. The timing is almost theatrical. Speaking of theatrical timing, consider the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered in 1901 among the wreck of a Roman cargo ship, it sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for over 50 years before anyone fully understood what it was. X-ray analysis conducted in the 1970s revealed a device of extraordinary mechanical complexity, 37 bronze gears, differential gear trains, a mechanism for predicting lunar and solar eclipses, planetary positions, and the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. It is accurate, genuinely, measurably accurate. Modern researchers using CT scanning technology, published in the journal Nature in 2021, confirmed additional functions including a prediction dial for the Saros eclipse cycle that matches observational data to within hours. What no one explains clearly is why it was on a cargo ship. Commercial shipping routes don't typically carry objects of that singular sophistication unless those objects are being delivered somewhere. Delivered to someone. Someone who understood what they were receiving. The mechanism implies not just a maker, but an audience of users, which implies a context, community of practice. And that community, along with every other device it may have produced, is gone. But here's what matters. The Antikythera mechanism was not found in a treasury. It was not found in a tomb or a temple. It was found in transit, meaning it was in use, operational, part of an ongoing world of mechanical practice that our surviving record simply does not reflect. Let's talk about what survives in text. Vitruvius, writing in the 1st century BCE in his De Architectura, still held in manuscript form at the Vatican Library, Codex Vaticanus Latinus 1575, describes a surveying instrument called the hodometer, a wheel-driven gear mechanism that counted distance traveled by road. Functional, practical, built to automate measurement. The principle is not trivial. It is mechanical information storage, the translation of physical motion into a countable output. That principle sits at the foundation of every modern odometer, every mechanical clock, and, in a more abstract sense, every computing system that translates physical state into representable data. Speaking of clocks, the first mechanical clock in the Western historical record appears in Europe in approximately 1300 CE. Yet Susong's astronomical clock tower, built in China in 1088 CE, used a water-powered escapement mechanism to drive astronomical displays and timekeeping functions that were, by any technical standard, a mechanical clock. The design is documented in Susong's own treatise, Xianxiang Fa Yao, a copy of which survives in the collection of the National Palace Museum in Taipei. It was built 400 years before European clockmakers are credited with the invention. I don't have answers, only patterns. Now let me be precise about something. None of these devices individually constitutes free energy in the way that phrase is used in contemporary discourse. The Yalopile requires steam, which requires fuel. The Baghdad battery requires an electrolyte. Susong's clock requires water. These are not violations of thermodynamics. They are not perpetual motion machines. The mainstream scientific community is correct to maintain that position. But free energy, as a concept, existed differently in the ancient world. The question being asked was not, how do we violate physical law? The question was, how do we extract work from systems that are already in motion? Wind, water, celestial mechanics, thermal differentials. These are not human-generated inputs. They are ambient conditions. The ancient engineers were not trying to create energy from nothing. They were trying to couple human need to forces that never stop running. Which brings me to what may be the most carefully buried document in this entire investigation. In 1589, Giambattista della Porta published Magia Naturalis, a compilation of natural philosophy, mechanical artifice, and what he called the secrets of nature. Among its chapters is a detailed description of a device that circulates water using thermal differentials in a closed system. No external pump, no ongoing human labor, simply heat differential driving fluid movement in a loop. The mechanism della Porta describes maps remarkably closely to what modern engineers call a thermosiphon, a device patented in various forms in the 19th century and currently used in passive cooling systems for nuclear reactors and spacecraft. Della Porta was not inventing it. He was compiling it from sources he does not fully identify. The pattern is not subtle. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. Maybe the Baghdad battery was a storage container. Maybe the Yalopile was purely ceremonial. Maybe Della Porta was synthesizing natural philosophy from classical texts that were themselves speculative. Maybe every anomaly in the record has an innocent explanation that simply hasn't been written down anywhere I can find. But the devices exist. Not theories. Not mythology. Physical objects, reconstructible from surviving texts, sitting in cataloged archives and museum collections in Baghdad, Athens, Florence, Taipei, and the Vatican. And the consistent pattern across all of them is not mystery. It is discontinuity. A moment, or more precisely several moments in several locations across several centuries, where the level of mechanical knowledge demonstrably exceeds what should have been possible given the known developmental record. That discontinuity demands explanation. The Antikythera mechanism required a community. The Baghdad battery required a purpose. Susong's clock required a tradition. You do not build a 37-gear bronze computational device in isolation. You build it at the end of a lineage. And the lineage in each of these cases is missing. This is what keeps me going back to that phrase from the Bibliotheca Medicia Lorenziana. Without fire, without wind, without the labor of men. Whoever wrote that was describing something. Something they had seen or heard of or been told once existed. And they thought it was remarkable enough to record, even briefly, even in a document that would sit uncatalogued for nearly 1,000 years. Consider the implications of that single data point. Not the machine itself, which may have been metaphorical, may have been an exaggeration, may have been a copyist's embellishment. But the fact that the description exists at all. The fact that someone in the ancient world had a frame of reference for a machine that required no human input to operate. That is not a fantasy. That is a concept. And concepts do not arise from nothing. They arise from experience. The Library of Alexandria held, at its height, somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, the range itself indicating how much we don't know. It was partially destroyed at least 3 times. First in Caesar's fire of 48 BCE, then by edict under Theophilus in 391 CE, and finally by the Arab conquest of 642 CE. Each of those dates sits near a moment of significant mechanical discontinuity in the historical record. The timing is almost theatrical, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I want to be clear about something. I am not arguing for conspiracy in the popular sense. I am not suggesting a single coordinated effort to suppress ancient knowledge. What I am suggesting is simpler and, in some ways, more disturbing. Knowledge is fragile. The conditions that produce certain kinds of knowledge, stable institutions, intergenerational transmission, well-funded patronage, protected archives, are exactly the conditions most easily destroyed by war, plague, and political upheaval. You don't need anyone to actively hide something to lose it. You just need enough disruption spread across enough time to sever the chain. What remains is what was written down, copied by scribes who may not have understood it, translated by scholars working centuries after the fact, and housed in archives that are themselves subject to the same fragility. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted in 2003. The Bibliotheca Medicia Lorenziana restricted access to its most fragile holdings for much of the 20th century. The original context of the Antikythera wreck, everything else on that ship, everything about where it was going and who sent it, is sitting on the floor of the Mediterranean at a depth we have only recently been able to reach. The archive still exists. Parts of it, anyway. That is the one thing I keep returning to. The machines were real. The knowledge was real. Someone built them, used them, taught others how to use them, and then, through a series of ruptures we have barely begun to document, the thread was cut. Not once, but repeatedly. In Greece, in Mesopotamia, in China, in Rome's libraries. Cut and partially restarted. Cut again. And each time it was cut, we lost not just the devices but the context, the understanding of why they worked, what problem they were solving, and what came next. The question I keep returning to is not, did ancient people have free energy? That framing is too simple, too easy to dismiss. The question is, what did the ancient world know about coupling human civilization to ambient physical forces, and how much of that knowledge has simply not survived? What problems were they trying to solve that we have been forced to resolve from scratch centuries later because the original work is gone? I don't know. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that somewhere in the Bibliotheca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, in a fragmented 9th century copy of a work attributed to Hero of Alexandria, there is a phrase describing a machine that operates without fire, without wind, without human labor. It may mean nothing. It may be a translation error. It may be a philosophical metaphor about celestial mechanics rather than a literal mechanical description. Or it may be the edge of something we haven't finished finding yet. And that is the part that keeps me up at night.